They thought it would be easy. They gathered in secret rooms, whispering plans to take him down. They believed that power could be snatched overnight, that a sudden strike would silence every voice of resistance. They thought the people would stay silent, that fear would once again rule the streets as it had in the past. But they underestimated him. They underestimated the man who had risen from the ranks, the man who had already defied impossible odds to lead a new vision. At dawn, armored vehicles moved through the city, their engines growling like predators in the early morning darkness. Soldiers received coded orders through radios, their faces hidden by the shadows of their helmets. Inside the presidential compound, a few loyal men waited, tense and alert, scanning every movement outside the gates. And there he was, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, standing calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he already knew how the day would end. They thought he was cornered. They thought his own men would turn against him the moment they were promised wealth and power. They thought the streets would tremble with panic, that people would hide in their homes as a new power swept in. But as the convoy approached the gates, something began to shift. A murmur spread through the ranks. Some soldiers slowed their pace, looking at one another, unsure, because these weren't just ordinary orders. These were orders to betray a man they had marched with, a man who had stood with them in the face of danger, a man who had promised them and their families a future free from corruption. And then something no one expected happened. The very soldiers sent to remove him stopped. One by one, they lowered their weapons. Instead of rushing the gates, they knelt before him. The silence was heavy, thick with disbelief, until the first voice rose in defiance. "We will not fight against our own." Others joined, their voices growing louder, their resolve spreading like wildfire through the ranks. The radios crackled with confusion as commanders demanded answers, but no one moved. Outside, the streets began to fill. Word traveled fast, carried by whispers, by shouts, by the urgent pounding of footsteps. Thousands poured into the streets, men, women, children, all chanting his name, their voices echoing through every corner of the city. They blocked every road, surrounded every checkpoint, forming a human shield that no force could break. They carried banners, they raised their fists, and they stared down anyone who dared to challenge their will. The conspirators watched from a distance, their plans unraveling before their eyes. What they thought would be a swift strike had turned into a spectacle of defiance. They saw a sea of people, unarmed yet unafraid, standing together as one. They saw soldiers who refused to be pawns in a game of greed. They saw a leader standing tall, while those who plotted against him scrambled in fear. And in that moment, the narrative changed. The world began to watch. News outlets scrambled to capture the scenes, images of soldiers embracing civilians, of flags waving high above the crowd, of a man standing on the steps of the compound, addressing his people with a voice steady and strong. "You have chosen your future," he said, his words carried by loudspeakers, by chants, by the beating hearts of those who believed in him. "And no one, no power, no betrayal will take it from you." The conspirators retreated into the shadows from which they came, their networks exposed, their names whispered in anger across the city. Some fled, some were captured, but none succeeded. Because they had planned to erase him, but instead they ignited a movement. What was meant to be a day of downfall became a day of unity. What was meant to be the end of a chapter became the beginning of something far greater. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once a soldier, now stood as a symbol, not just of power, but of unshakable resolve. He was no longer merely a man in uniform. He was the voice of his people, the shield of their hope, the embodiment of their defiance. And as the sun set over the city that night, the chants still rang through the streets. Children climbed onto rooftops waving flags. Elders wept with pride. Families embraced one another with tears in their eyes. The soldiers who had once been ordered to remove him now stood guard at his side, not because they were commanded to, but because they chose to. They tried to remove Captain Ibrahim Traoré from power. They thought they could strip him of his position, of his voice, of his future. But what happened next shocked everyone. It wasn't just a failed coup. It wasn't just a broken plan. It was a reminder that true power doesn't come from weapons or wealth. It comes from the people who refuse to be silenced. And on that day, the world saw it clearly, a leader standing unbroken and a nation standing with him.